The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what direction will Canadian politics take with Mark Carney as Prime Minister? Then, Federal Housing Minister Nate Erskine-Smith joins us to discuss the housing crisis in these uncertain economic and political times. That's all next on The Agenda. Mark Carney will become Canada's 24th Prime Minister with huge challenges on his plate. From Canada's place in the world to a contemptuous relationship with the 47th President of the United States. And with expectations that he'll call an election any day now, will tariffs trump everything else? Joining us to unpack all of this, we welcome in Calgary, Alberta, Zane Velji. He's a partner at North Weather and Alberta NDP strategist. In the nation's capital, Tonda McCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. With us here in studio, Ashley Chinatti, Vice President at Macmillan Vantage and a Liberal strategist, and Amanda Galbraith, co-founder and partner at Oyster Group and a Conservative strategist. And it's delightful to see you two again here in our provincial capital, and then hello Tonda in our nation's capital, and Zane in a place that wishes it were Alberta's capital, but it isn't really.
Hi,
okay,
everybody.
Here we go. Ashley, you got to hand it to Mark Carney. 86% is a hell of a victory. His victory speech, you and I were both there, the victory speech didn't exactly light the room on fire. Any concerns about that?
I think that that's a bit of an understatement. No, it definitely was a very safe speech, maybe a little bit too long. But as someone who's written these kinds of speeches that people like to armchair quarterback after the day, I don't want to do too much of that. But I think if I was to tell his team anything right now, it would be maybe a little bit shorter and a little bit punchier on the message. But I think that's what they're going for, is this idea of boring and stable and safe, and the contrast of all of the bombast and uncertainty of Donald Trump, and the way in which Pierre Poilievre can sometimes mirror that style. And I think part of the reason we're seeing the bump for Liberals in the polls right now is that Mark Carney presents a really stark contrast to that. And, they can continue to do that, but perhaps maybe in just slightly fewer words. Yeah.
Tonda, what was your read on the Carney victory speech?
Well, I've heard him do other speeches, and he's not one who does light up a room by any stretch. Look, I thought he made some pretty hard-hitting, took some pretty hard-hitting shots at the Trump administration and Americans. But it was only yesterday, actually, that I noticed that he didn't repeat his own threat to do dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs. He said the government is already doing tariffs that will maximize the impact on Americans. So I thought that was an interesting tack. We didn't notice it in the light of the rhetoric around we're all in and we're not going to drop tariffs until they respect us. And that was one of the big applause lines of the speech. The other thing that was very effective in a room full of Liberals was the attack on the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre. So, look, he's I think gotten better over the last 7 weeks of a campaign. He needed to be, I think a bit more up to speed on that front beforehand. But I think I agree with Ashley. Like, they do seem to be going for adult in the room, gravitas, serious, and not too concerned about looking like the retail politician that maybe we've all come to expect our leaders to be.
Zane, his first and most important decision presumably will be, when are we going to go to the polls? If you were advising him, what would you suggest?
Go as soon as possible. I mean, right now, the polling is not great or perfect for you, but man, we were talking about a Liberal Party that was going to be in the doldrums if existed at all back in December and January, given their lack of provincial infrastructure. There was Liberal folks I was talking to that were speculating the fact that, if we don't get out of our current positioning, we are in a situation where it's not just a decade that we don't get to chance to form government again. Are we even a real thing? Because this has been made in Justin Trudeau's image for the last 10 years, and we don't have the organizing apparatus in the provinces. I'm not saying all of that's changed right now, but much of that has changed right now. And even if it's a sugar high, go to the polls on a sugar high, because it's better than dragging this thing out, making any sort of deal with the NDP and waiting till your maximal sort of point in October. It's a matter of hours and days, not weeks and months, Steve.
Amanda, I know Doug Ford just did it and did it successfully, but what would you say about the advisability of a new prime minister going to the polls immediately at this particular moment in our history with this trade war and this 51st state nonsense going on?
I mean, I think politically it makes a ton of sense, right? We don't really know much about him. There's a lot of questions around what he has and has not disclosed about his assets, his interests, and I think that continues to be questions that loom over his head. Do I think it's responsible, one, to prorogue Parliament in the middle of a trade war, to have a Liberal leadership vanity project in the middle of a trade war, to then launch an election and have a brand new No, I don't think any of that is responsible. And I think hopefully Canadians will look and askance on the Liberal Party for what they've done, because I do think it has really set the country back.
Okay, I got to follow up and say, but it was okay for Doug Ford to do it?
Well, I'm not saying it was okay for Doug Ford to do it, but I'm saying politically it makes sense, right? Doug Ford did it. He was successful at it. If I was advising Carney, I think like all of us around this room, we'd probably tell him, yeah, for sure you should go. The Conservatives are sitting on $40 million worth of a war chest. They can advertise you into smithereens over the next 3-4 months. Also, we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. It might just get worse. But there's 50% tariffs on aluminum and steel apparently as of today. So I think it's a smart decision. I don't think it's a politically responsible decision. And I do think, again, to Shane's point about the sugar high, yes, eventually people are going to come down from he's not Justin Trudeau, and we've got to take a look at what we've got in front of us.
One of the reasons Liberals are feeling so good these days is, Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? Nick Nanos is a pretty fine pollster, and here's what he has been discovering over the past few months. The Conservatives back in December were almost at 47% in Nanos tracking. They are now just a shade over 35%. The Liberals were down in the dumps, 21+%. They're now almost at 35%. We have a statistical tie right now. NDP down a tad, Bloc up a tad, Greens down a tad, the People's Party down a tad, but essentially the big switch here has been the Liberals are back in the game. Amanda, why do you think that is?
I think we have a different scenario, right? We have a different leader. Clearly, Justin Trudeau was wildly unpopular. I mean, clearly. Also, I don't think anybody would expect the Conservatives to sit at 47% for the duration of an election period. Also, we have an existential threat to the country, which is Donald Trump, right? And inevitably, whenever there's an existential threat to anyone, the citizens and Canadians will move to support the government, the people in charge, the people who wear the mantle of that, right? So we even saw Justin Trudeau sort of rise a little bit in popularity over the last 2 months, which I would have said was impossible based on what had happened over the last decade. Do I think these are static numbers? No, they never are. Do I think that at the end of the day, this means the Liberals are going to march to an easy victory? No, I don't. I think it's competitive now. But as a Conservative, sitting at 36, 37 points, like when I was working on the Harper campaigns in 04 and 06, we would have thrown a party in the war room if we were sitting there. So I think everyone needs to kind of calm down a little bit. Yes, we're going to have to fight an election campaign, but that is what we should be doing as a country. And also, Mark Carney has not been tested. He's not a retail politician. He's been around politics a long time. But that's very different from actually being in the game.
Yeah. Tonda, do we infer from these numbers that there wasn't a hatred of the Liberal Party back in December? This was an anti-Trudeau thing. Now that Trudeau's gone, the Liberals are back in the game? Is that how you see it?
I think to a large extent, yes, it was that Trudeau was so unpopular. And we've even though in the face of the Trump threat, as Amanda just said, Trudeau's own approval ratings have gone up 12 points in 6 weeks. So now he's out. It's a new game. I think politically, though, the fact that it's a statistical tie in those numbers is one thing. The aggregator of all the polls right now is showing at this point a Conservative minority. What is that reflecting? That reflects still a bit of fatigue with 10 years of Liberals. But I don't underestimate the fluidity and volatility of this campaign. This is going to be a campaign unlike any other amidst a trade war. Donald Trump may be dialing back and on again, off again, pausing his, sectoral tariffs, as we've seen earlier today with steel and aluminum, and more threats coming on other sectors. But his big play, April 2nd, where he intends to show the world how he intends to deal with what he calls unfair trade practices, will land smack in what I expect to be a federal campaign. And that is something that nobody can predict at this stage. No poll, no pollster, no pundit can really tell us where that's going. And to be honest, I mean, I kind of thought yesterday as I attended the Pierre Poilievre scrum and watched Mark Carney kind of come into office, I think there's such an attempt now to be careful on everybody's side. I think Pierre Poilievre could potentially be one very snarky, nasty comment away from not looking like the Prime Minister Canadians want these days. And Mark Carney is perhaps, one stumble, one gaffe away from also making Canadians think, are we still in the old era, or what's going to happen? So I think, honestly, so volatile. I've never seen anything like it.
Well, you've led me nicely to the next question for Ashley, which is, Liberals on Sunday that I spoke to, without exception, are feeling so much more wind in their sails nowadays because of these numbers. Should they risk inhaling here?
I think that when there's momentum, you have to seize it, right? And even if Mr. Carney were to, say, let's take a breath and let's work with some of the opposition parties and try and get a budget through and respond to tariffs and meet the moment, I think he would be operating in, a bit of a lame duck limbo for the next 6 months. We have basically since Chrystia Freeland wrote that letter in December that kind of started off this whole process that got us here, where she publicly called for Prime Minister Trudeau to go. The federal government has been at a stasis point in a lot of substantive ways for stakeholders, with the exceptions of responding directly to tariffs. And I think that we need something to unlock and we need something to move. And I think for the good of the country, an election, regardless of the result, will offer some clarity that I think we need at this moment in time. Now, as a partisan, we're definitely feeling good. And I was talking to members I know from across the country who are seeing their internal polls that they've done at the riding level, very specifically tied to Mark Carney's name, boost up. And people who thought they were in tough are now feeling really enthused. They're hitting the doors with a lot more, vigor, and they're getting a much better reception at the doors as well. So I think Liberals are feeling pretty good right now.
You use the expression in tough, and that's going to take me to Zane, because these numbers are tough for the NDP. They weren't great back in December, and they're even worse right now. As an NDP surrogate, where are you on this? What advice do you possibly give your party to get back in the game here? Because at the moment, they're not.
Well, to be clear, I'm not a federal NDP surrogate at all. I work for the Alberta NDP. Federally, the NDP are in tough. And I think the opportunities that we have right now as a federal NDP are limited. In fact, I'd say the window is closing on an opportunity for the federal NDP right now, because if you look at those numbers, the Nanos numbers that you put up on the screen, Steve, you're seeing that the initial surge and the breath of life that the Liberals had was on the backs of the NDP, where they were at like 10, 12, 11 points. Now you're seeing that the Liberals are taking vote share away from the Conservatives, and the NDP are still at 14, 15 points. I still think the floor is lower for the NDP. I hate to say that, but when you look at those numbers, we've seen the historical last-minute strategic voting that happens between progressives. And now in this very acute moment of the Trump threat and the Poilievre threat, you know that the Liberals are going to make that argument. They're going to inhale, cough it up, and inhale again and tell the NDP that, listen, if you're an NDP supporter right now, 2025 is not the time to vote your conscience. You have to come over to us. And they're going to make that argument, as they historically have, probably even more successfully than they have. So the NDP are in tough right now because, A, the ballot box question on tariffs, Trump, the economy, not in their natural wheelhouse. And B, you have someone as the central bank governor, former central bank governor, coming in saying, this is my wheelhouse. And you have those historical elements. I think the floor for the NDP are lower than they are even when we see those Nanos numbers, Steve.
Okay, Tonda, I am really going to get out over my skis here in asking you this next question, but Canadians are going to be doing this over the next few weeks. They're going to be speculating and trying to understand all the possible permutations that numbers like that could deliver. And the reality is, it's possible the Conservatives could come back with a minority government based on those numbers if they were to hold up. I know, a ton of ifs. My question is, in your judgment, does Pierre Poilievre have acceptable relationships with other party leaders, the smaller parties in Parliament, whereby if he does win a minority government, whenever this election happens, he could keep it alive?
That's really something that I can't say I've seen a lot of evidence of. If we're going to base whatever speculation on what we've seen in the past in terms of relations between parties, there have been times when the Conservatives have worked in minority government, for example, with the Bloc Québécois, with the NDP. They they have shown an ability under a previous leader to do that. They have shown an ability in the previous parliament, or in the, in the last, I would say, like since 2019 and 2021, since the Liberal minority governments have been in place, the ability to push things through parliament, agendas at committees, ordering the government to produce documents on the pandemic, for example, getting the government to move on the Winnipeg lab investigation. But I cannot say that I've seen Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Blanchette and Mr. Singh show any love for each other. If anything, both the BQ and the NDP leaders of late have been slamming the Conservatives, ripping them at every turn, politically, as not just their rivals, but as bad for Canada. So Poilievre has really placed his bet full on a majority government. He has been mercilessly criticizing Blanchette, the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, calling him sellout Singh. I mean, there's no going back. How do you go back from calling basically another leader a traitor to Canada, and at every turn calling the BQ leader, a separatist who wants to destroy Canada? Like, how do you walk that back when your own, I guess they'll try, but I'm just trying to, I guess, to answer your question based on what I've seen and what I've heard over the last, not just couple of years, but even last 8 weeks, it's just, I don't see it.
Amanda, I mean, that is the question. Is it majority or bust for Pierre Poilievre?
I don't think that's the case. I think this is highly speculative, right? We have to go through an entire campaign. Having worked for a new Conservative leader under a minority government, you make friends in all kinds of places. And I think that's
You're talking to Stephen Harper?
Yeah, exactly, right? Stephen Harper was able to very successfully work with the other parties across the aisle to maintain minorities and then also a majority government eventually, right? And I think there's very much a possibility of Pierre Poilievre doing that. I think any leader, when they get the job, they grow into it over time, right? Certainly, we've seen aggressive rhetoric in the House of Commons against one another. That's not a new thing. But I think, bottom line is we're going to have a debate in this country, as we rightfully should, about who's best to lead us through this process. Is it a fourth term for the existing Liberal government? And yes, it's got a new face, but it's still the same ministers. It's the same advisors behind the scenes. It's the same people that brought us here over the last decade. Or is it Pierre Poilievre and his team? And I think Jay made an excellent point. The NDP's floor has not been reached, and they're in very big danger, I think, of going much lower. And I think that will also benefit the Liberals.
We started by talking about the Carney victory speech and about how much we thought it just livened up no, we didn't say that actually. We said the opposite, how it didn't exactly liven up the room, but there was a nugget of an indication of what a future strategy might look like. So let's play some of that. Sheldon, if you would, the clip.
So Donald Trump thinks he can weaken us with his plan to divide and conquer. Pierre Poilievre's plan will leave us divided and ready to be conquered. Because a person who worships at the altar of Donald Trump will kneel before him, not stand up to him.
Okay, so we know where this is going, right? Pierre Poilievre is a mini Donald Trump. Is that going to play?
I think the people will tell us if it plays or not. I think it's, as of right now, a really smart strategy. We have seen, that for rallying the base was a great line, right? And yes, that speech was about him introducing himself to Canadians as the Prime Minister designate, but it was also about saying to everybody in that room, look, we have another war to fight, right? And these are people who've just gone through running a very rapid leadership race after being in government through kind of crisis after crisis. There's a lot of Liberals in this country who are probably feeling a bit of fatigue right now, and you need that rallying point to give people the motivation to go knock the doors and make the phone calls and do the hard work of a campaign. So that's one motivation that's hitting. And the second is, it is deadly to be associated with Trump right now. And I think that the way that Pierre Poilievre has played footsie with some kind of really far-right personalities like Jordan Peterson, those threads are things that for Liberals can and should be pulled on as we enter a campaign that's going to be about who do you think is really going to stand up to Donald Trump.
I got to give Amanda time to respond to that because we've seen Poilievre take pains, particularly in the last couple of weeks, to put out tweets there saying, never the 51st state. Donald Trump, you're wrong about all of this. Trump has actually blasted back at him, saying, I don't know what's happened to Poilievre, but he's saying some nasty things about me right now. What kind of case does Pierre Poilievre have to make in order to make sure that he's not associated with Trump?
I think he continues to do that, right? To criticize the president of the United States who's attacking our country, talking about Canada First. We've seen the Canada First rallies. He had a massive rally in London, Ontario, the same day as the Liberal convention, which, by the way, had more people attend it than the Liberal convention, and they had an overflow room. So I think there's still, yes, I get that people are excited that Mark Carney is here. He's deigned to descend from the UK to lead us through this crisis. But at the end of the day, I think everyday Canadians, there's still momentum for Pierre Poilievre. And yes, Liberals and other parties are going to continue to say, oh, the Canadian Conservative leader is just like the US president, which, like, plus ça change. When I worked for Harper, he was Bush, like, yes, and like on and on. He has to very vocally criticize Trump, which he's been doing. I think doing interviews with U.S. media, right-wing or conservative media outlets is something that conservative leaders should do, period, and they have to be getting around mainstream media. We're seeing the same strategy, by the way, from like the Carney team too, right? I mean, he's gone on, the most successful media interview he's done was on a U.S. like
Jon Stewart
fake news show or whatever we're calling it, and he has yet to actually face the media in any kind of substantive press conference, especially since it's become Prime Minister designate. I know we had like a little like catch me in the hallway thing yesterday, but I'm sure Tonda and her colleagues would love to have a nice shot at him if they could to go through.
Let's ask about that because, yeah, you know what? The state of play has changed so much in terms of journalists doing their jobs right now, Tonda, and I'd like you to speak to this. They're going on American television shows. I mean, Chrystia Freeland was on an American television show. She was on Bill Maher's show a couple of weeks ago. They are doing their level best to avoid sort of legacy journalists and are going on friendly media, the likes of which I think we've never seen before. What is that doing to the way Canadians learn about who these people are?
Just to dial back for a second, I think Chrystia Freeland actually was more accessible to reporters than Mr. Carney ever was in that campaign. But it's kind of hard to untangle some of this. I mean, Canadian politicians going on American media at this time is actually smart politics for the country, to transmit the message in the way that Premier Doug Ford has been doing. But they were doing it previously in the hopes of getting elected, in Carney's case, leader of the Liberal Party. Now that they're here, there is a huge expectation that they should meet reporters in this in Ottawa as part of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, meet reporters here to take questions because obviously the knowledge and breadth of the questions will be different than you're getting at, scrum opportunities in different regions of the country. But look, the job of doing this job is absolutely, it's been harder ever since social media kind of made everybody think they're a journalist, for one, and made governments and political parties double down on their message discipline and try to avoid or do end runs around legacy media or mainstream media journalists. But I think there's still value in it. And I think we're seeing that in some cases, they're coming back to transmit their message. The Conservatives have been hounding us to cover them, to show up at their news conferences where, by the way, they deny us questions. So I managed to get a question into Pierre Poilievre yesterday, but they didn't I wanted another question, but they didn't give them. And so it's a constant push and pull, tug of war. It has been for a number of years. Will it get better under, any future prime minister? I'm not holding my breath. I think it's always going to be a struggle. The industry across the board, whether you're in newspapers or broadcast, audiences are fractured, and there's a long-term challenge for all of us on the business side.
Amanda, can you give me a quick word on that? Because I went to Pierre Poilievre's press conference last Friday, which was held in Toronto. And yes, he went out, he spoke in French, he spoke in English, he spoke at length. It was then 5 questions, some of which were from very friendly media, no follow-up questions, and then he walked out. If you're trying to win friends and influence people, is that the way to go?
I mean, this is the same strategy the Liberals, literally we've had a Prime Minister designate who has not actually faced the Canadian media. It's 48 hours, right? It's 2 days.
He did yesterday. He did a 3-minute scrum yesterday.
He walked out a hallway and there was, how's your day? You feeling good? Are you excited?
Count.
Yeah.
It
doesn't count. Okay.
It was not, that was not. Pierre Poilievre stood up in the House of Commons, and yes, like Tonda can say he did not take questions away, but he actually stood there and took questions from people who shouted at him. Mark Carney has yet to do so. If you have he's the Prime Minister designate. That is insane to me.
I
that we
think
have
technically he actually isn't yet. I don't think he's the Prime Minister designate until the Governor General meets him and says, you're the incoming Prime Minister.
I appreciate that, but he's regardless going to lead the country
Yes.
in like, what, 48 hours? Or he's starting to lead the country. I understand I'm getting all kinds of, this is going to be the decom, here's the new ministers, Jean Charest may or may not be in the cabinet. But I think, this strategy of, yes, reducing mainstream media questions is not one that's pursued just by Conservatives. So did Justin Trudeau. So Mark Carney's not even taking them. So I think we could all do more I love a good scrum like the next person, and I encourage Mark Carney to do what Pierre Poilievre did yesterday, which is like take some cues.
Zane, you want to come in on this?
I'm going to quote you on that,
listen,
okay.
I don't think we're going to see the Arnie Vinnick from The West Wing, ask me as many questions until I'm absolutely tired and you're absolutely tired with asking your questions. The media environment, as Tonda said, is fractured. And in fact, the owned media that these political parties have, as well as the influencer media that they have connections to, is probably more punchier and reaches more people than many traditional media outlets. It's a reality of the situation. And I'm not saying these folks are journalists or that their questions are better or that their accountability, but right now it's about reach and profile. And then what folks are doing on all sides of the political spectrum is taking that advice and taking the modeling that they've seen from the United States, where Donald Trump went on friendly podcasts that weren't necessarily political, but asked questions that really humanized them. And if I'm predicting the Carney strategy, it's going to be less so about politics as it relates to media, other than when it's going to be about tariffs and Trump, and there's going to be soft elements to it and more sort of lifestyle elements to it. I suspect that's going to be the Carney strategy heading forward. In addition to that, the one question I'm asking here myself without a really clear answer to, Steve, is when Carney calls an election, how much of this time, this election writ period, is he going to be spending campaigning versus doing the job of a prime minister in one of the most acute crises we've ever seen? And I think the question is, how much of the Doug Ford playbook that we just saw in Ontario does he borrow, where he does things like go to Washington and meet with the president or meet with senators, meet with Congress people, versus doing the conventional coast-to-coast campaigning. And I think that is also going to dictate a lot of what this campaign looks like, what it feels like, where one person who's got the advantage and benefit of being prime minister, how much will he use it during this campaign? Even if his mandate is slim from a small group of liberals in a very acute time, he may have the credibility and frankly the rationale to use the powers of prime ministership while in a general election.
Okay. Got about 5 minutes to go here, and I want to put one more issue on the table. And the narrative of what an election about is always something the parties fight over, right? What's this election about? What's the frame we want to put around it? What's the narrative? What's the story we're trying to tell? For the longest time, Amanda, to you first, the Conservatives have wanted this to be a carbon tax election. And Mr. Poilievre said it again yesterday, said this is going to be a carbon tax election. Is this really going to be a carbon tax election?
I think we will talk about the carbon tax for sure, because, we don't know what's going to happen with that. Yes, Mark Carney's allegedly taken the consumer one off the table that he's championed for the last decade, but there will also be an industrial tax that may be increased. So Conservatives are certainly going to talk about it. But I think the bigger question to my mind is going to be, at least from the Conservative side, is do the Liberals get rewarded with a fourth term, a fourth mandate? Is the way the country has gone over the last decade, are you richer? Are we happier? Are we healthier? Can I afford groceries right now? Are these the people you want to reward and line up against Donald Trump? And who are the same reason, by the way, we are so behind the eight ball on pipelines, on infrastructure, on our ability to pivot. So I think that will be the issue. But no matter, we saw this play out in Ontario to a certain extent, and I do think global, events, dear boy, events will be the big dictator of what happens. And I think Zane's onto something. My guess is we'll see a foreign trip out of Mr. Carney at some point.
Well, it worked well for Doug Ford, so why not? That's the play in the playbook. Tonda, come on in here. Is this going to be a carbon tax election?
I doubt it. Carbon tax may be an element of a larger campaign that it's going to be the economy stupid election, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be the election that wraps up not just the greater economic threat from Trump and the United States. That's going to have all balled up into that argument, the annexation threat and the sovereignty concerns that Canadians have. And so this election campaign, rather than be, I think, on, are you going to get a sales tax cut, or are you going to get a check for your childcare, or whatever that, we've seen play out in other elections. I think this election campaign is now going to have Canadians really focused on bigger threats to bigger sectors of our economy and our ability to survive as a country and push back against the U.S. I hear that everywhere. Whereas it used to be perhaps a change ballot question, I think that there's a question now around how do we stabilize and grow our economy and wean our dependence from the U.S. I see that. I don't see how that doesn't factor into the bigger narrative questions. No matter what any party wants to put forward, I think that will be the framing.
I know, Ashley, that the Liberals are going to want to portray this as a brand new start with a new leader, divorced from anything that transpired over the past 10 years under Justin Trudeau. But the reality is we're going to hear Conservatives say, why should the Liberals deserve a fourth straight term? What's going to be the punchback on that?
I think the punchback on that is going to be, who do you trust to lead the country in these tumultuous times? And who do you think the steady hand would be on the tiller? And I think that's why Liberals endorsed Mr. Carney so resoundingly, is we think that he is the one to lead us through these troubled waters, and we think that he will put the best value proposition in the window. Because I do think as much as Pierre Poilievre and his team will probably want to make this about the Liberal incumbency and a fourth mandate, and we're going to hear a lot about that. I think we did just learn loud and clear in Ontario that you can sit there and say every single metric of success in this province or in this country has gone backwards over the last, whether it's 7 years or 10 years. And do you like the state of your healthcare system? Do you like the state of your roads? Do you like the state of the housing supply?
And the answer was no to all of those things?
Was no to all of those things.
And the guy won anyway.
But there's a safety in what you know in troubled times. And if you position yourself as the person who is the Captain Canada, then I think that is who will win this election. I think that any party who thinks they're going to, I just learned this lesson in a very, we all learned this lesson in a very clear way. I don't think you can change the ballot box question right now with what's going to happen over the next 6 weeks. And I think you need to fight it on who's the best to take on Trump and win.
Zane, I thought one of the most amusing things that I heard at the convention on Sunday were Liberals coming to the microphone and championing and boasting about the fact that they'd put in pharmacare and Dentacare, which we know that they really didn't want to do if not for the fact that the NDP forced it on them. Ashley, you disagree, but I'm sticking with my story here. If that's the case, where does that leave the NDP here? If the Liberals are getting credit for stuff the NDP made them do, where does that leave the NDP here?
Back to my previous point, still not experiencing their floor. That's where it leaves them. I mean, unfortunately right now, I agree with Ashley. The ballot box question seems to be baked. And I think there's a version of the ballot box question that advantages the Conservatives, which is that if it's about the economy and plainly about the economy, if they can kind of shift it away a bit from the American dynamics and make it about the economy, stupid as Tonda said, advantage Conservatives. If it's about fighting Trump and wrapping yourself in the Canadian flag, advantage Liberals. That's a nuance, but it's an important nuance. The party I'm not mentioning is the NDP, though, Steve. Like, I think they're going to be the ones that ultimately lose out to the Liberals here. Their fighting chance is to pick up certain ridings in this place and target them specifically. It's not sexy advice for them, but it's to say, in the midst of this air war, this changing ballot box question, the NDP strategy has to be, what are the ridings we can win, and where can we then ultimately hope and pray that we are the balance of power once again in order to influence a minority parliament, either way that ends up going.
Amanda, just in our last 40 seconds or so here, Conservatives were really feeling great about things when they were up around 47% in the polls. I'm wondering is there a little disillusionment right now with the fact that they've sort of water has found its level?
I think as a country, we're all concerned about what's happening with Trump, right? It feels to me a little pre-COVID, like COVID-y almost, right? What's going to happen economically? Can my business survive? So I think Conservatives and Canadians across the country are concerned about that. I also think we're long overdue for an election, for a leader to have a mandate to lead this country through this crisis. And no matter who the result is, I think we'll all be better off for having this issue resolved and having a functioning government, which we have not had for the last 2 to 3 months. So I think that's where Conservatives' heads are at, is that let's go. Let's get this done. And I think let's have a leader in place that can lead us forward.
Gotcha. I want to thank the four of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. Zane Velji in Calgary, Alberta, Tonda McCharles in the nation's capital, and here in the studio, Ashley Chinatti and Amanda Galbraith. Great to be with you all tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Until the trade war began, one of the most pressing issues in the country was the housing crisis. The federal government has put billions on the table, as have the provinces, to get stuff done. But affordability and homelessness so far haven't shown much improvement. With us now for more, the Federal Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, Nate Erskine-Smith, who's also the Liberal MP for Beaches East York, and we welcome you back to the studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to just start with a very basic question about when you took this job on, which is not even 3 months ago. I assume you knew you're probably here for a good time, not a long time, as the song goes.
I said short runway, I think, in my opening remarks when I was swearing in.
Exactly. So I guess the obvious first question is, can you, there's going to be an election called soon. You may not even have this portfolio a month or two from now.
Yeah.
What made you think, or have you discovered that you can or cannot actually do anything in such a narrow period of time?
I mean, I went in eyes wide open, where this is such a challenge. It's decades in the making, and we're not going to get out of it in 3 months with me as the minister. Now, I was able to build on the success of my predecessor, where I think as of last year, we have a pretty comprehensive set of policies in place, and I'm able to deliver on a lot of those policies now. And so I've been out making announcements on Housing Accelerator Fund. I've been out making announcements on public transit, and there are real dollars in communities that are helping to get housing built and greater density near transit, and that's all really good. The next part of this is what comes next, and really putting my own stamp on what comes next. And I've been vocal about the need to remove barriers to getting the market to build, but also been vocal about the need to double non-market housing and really play in that space as well.
Is it a good thing, or is it a harder thing for you doing your job, the fact that the Trump trade war has taken over the political agenda of the country?
Harder in the sense that the overriding focus, of course, as it rightly should be, is focused on defending our economic and national interests. The other challenge is, as we want to drive down the cost of home building, uncertainty and the increased risk of the economic uncertainty we face and rightly face with the threat of tariffs, that undermines confidence and undermines the ability for the market to build. And so our objectives are at odds, and we need to focus on defending our interests against Donald Trump, and that's the most important job. But look, the second most important job, and you said at the top, is addressing the housing crisis. And yes, they're at odds in some ways in terms of the challenges, but we've got to do both at the same time.
Because I just wonder if you're going to the Minister of Finance saying, I'd really love a few more $1 billion to help do this A, B, and C programs I've got. And then Dominic LeBlanc says to you, yeah, but I need those billions to deal with the tariff war.
Yeah.
So
well, even more challenging is we haven't even got through a budget cycle with me as minister. I would love to get through a budget cycle. But no, I think there's actually an appetite to get things built, right? So you want to make sure that you are defending our interests in the short term with retaliatory tariffs, and we see that. And there's been a really strong, forceful, united response. You see premiers stepping up with their own non-tariff responses as well, and that's all really important. You also need to start to look to stimulus, and what does it look like to get things moving and get things built, and no more is that more important than housing. And so I do think when we think of stimulus, it can't just be short-term jobs. It's got to be, how do we create economic benefits in the short term, but that are also going to serve us in a sustainable way over the long term, and housing does just that. They called that
Build Back Better once upon a time.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, but in this case, I look at it as how do we partner with industry to say, what are your challenges? And I've tried to do this when I crisscrossed the country. When I was in Montreal, I met with Quebec builders and was asking their challenges. Their big challenge was there's this huge gap in wastewater infrastructure. Some municipalities in Quebec have put a moratorium on home building because they don't have the actual infrastructure. Well, we've got an infrastructure fund, not nearly enough money to cover that gap. But look, the Canada Infrastructure Bank does this work too, housing enabling infrastructure, and they finance it. So we are trying to play in that space and help the market build market supply. And then the second part of this is we know that the market is not going to deliver the affordability that we need. So a renewed focus on community housing. And you mentioned challenges on homelessness, but I mean, in Ontario, it's especially acute. It's a challenge all across this country, and we've got to be seized with that as well, help those in the greatest need.
We're going to get to both those things, but one of the things you said a moment ago is that you're trying to figure out how to bring the cost of building new homes down.
Yeah.
And yet here are tariffs, which are going to ensure that the cost of doing everything goes up.
Yeah, tariffs alone are not going to have a ton of an impact on housing specifically. It really is the economic uncertainty. If the Bank of Canada acts, that will help to some degree, but it's uncertainty is a real barrier to the market acting. And so we need to be there to say we're going to help drive down the costs on the tax side. We're going to make sure we cut red tape and move things quickly through permitting. And we have to make sure we innovate and we make sure we have economies of scale to home building, that we drive down the costs as much as we can.
Doug Ford has said he wants 1.5 million homes built by the year 2031. You're smiling already because you know, as every expert I've talked to knows, there is no way in, HE double hockey sticks that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But presumably you see yourself as having a role to help make that happen.
Completely.
What is that role?
So one, partnership with provinces that are willing to partner with us, partnership with municipalities, and just a recognition that we all have an important role to play. Municipalities have an incredible role to play in removing red tape and expediting permitting. Provinces, with a stroke of a pen, can move things even faster because municipalities are obviously creatures of the province. Our role is really the federal spending power and making sure that we use that fiscal firepower to drive change, and we are doing that. You take the Housing Accelerator Fund, it was a $4.4 billion fund. It was directly focused on basically rewarding municipalities that delivered ambition in cutting red tape, ending restrictive zoning, getting more gentle density everywhere, greater density in your transit. Every fund that we've got, the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, that's wastewater, water, housing enabling infrastructure is how you should think about it. That fund also is tied to conditions of how do we make sure we're driving down development charges, stabilizing development charges. Our public transit fund makes sure there's density in your transit. So this spending power is really important.
Is it working? That Housing Accelerator Fund, is it working?
It is, yeah. I mean, you got to be careful how you judge success, because we all want to judge success by housing starts and completions, and that is how we're ultimately going to be judged in the end. But at the end of the day, when you see 200 municipalities across this country that have deals through the Housing Accelerator Fund that are changing zoning, that are upzoning, that are cutting through red tape, that are expediting permitting processes, speeding up timelines, all because federal dollars have been on the table, yeah, it's changed the system and it's changed how we build homes. So I think that is really important, and we are going to continue to see results. It's not going to be overnight, though, and I think this is just the thing I do want to leave people with. You have a federal government that in fits and starts between 2015 and 2017 got back in the game. 2017, the National Housing Strategy got us back in the game in housing after decades of bipartisan neglect. And really now it's a question not of direction but of scale. Last year we have a comprehensive plan in place, but we need to double down on that spending in many ways. And I think Carney will say spend less and invest more, but housing truly, especially community housing, is an investment we need to make.
High immigration got the blame for a lot of the housing crunch.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that was fair?
In part, yeah. I mean, you got to look at it to say, from a broader perspective, population growth is we have to match population growth with housing starts, right? And we weren't there, and that was partly driven by, especially post-pandemic, the increase in immigration. I'm wary of, with such a complex challenge, saying it's one thing and one thing only, but as a basic matter of supply and demand, you got to make sure that supply keeps pace with demand. And we have seen action, and people should know this too. We've seen serious action from the federal government to make sure we see those numbers stabilize, especially when it comes to temporary immigration, which, again, people can point fingers, and you can look at international students and provinces and really encouraging some colleges and universities to really take advantage of that and balance their books on the backs of international students in an improper way. That created challenges, especially in certain communities around housing. We are stabilizing that in a serious way. That's important. There's still a bit more work to be done on that front, but at the end of the day, it's not enough to take action on immigration. We also have to get homes built.
For sure, but if the immigration rates are going down, which your government has said they will do, is that to say the housing crisis is going to be a little less significant?
It will ease it, for sure.
It will.
Yeah, I think unquestionably. And I think if there's some criticism, I would say, all politicians probably came a little too late to that realization, and provincial, federal, and there is action now. And so as those numbers stabilize and as we see demand soften to a degree on that front, demand's not softening in Toronto, but as demand softens to a degree as a result of the immigration changes, we now need to double down our efforts to get things built.
I guess one of the reasons I'm raising this is that we have seen, particularly in the United States, how immigrants can be demonized as being the focus of all problems for our society.
Yeah.
And I want to be sure the federal government is not doing that in this case.
No,
saying we have a housing crisis because we have too many immigrants here.
No, I don't think one should especially demonize certain individuals or certain communities. I mean, international students, temporary foreign workers, people who are coming here to seek a better life. they make our country a better place. There's no question about it. At the same time, from a macro perspective, from a broader perspective, you want to say, how do we as decision makers ensure that we're sitting down, the immigration minister is sitting down with the housing minister, is sitting down with housing ministers across this country and saying, our targets have to match your targets. How do we make sure that the population growth is being matched by housing supply? And it's not to, again, point fingers and blame. It's how do we work together to make sure we're doing what's right.
So bottom line here, you've had the job for almost 3 months. Is it easier for a young family to buy a home in this country now?
After 3 months?
Thanks to your having had this job for almost 3 months.
I will say a few things about what I've been able to do. I have been able to, I hope, move things more quickly through the system when it comes to transit. So in Toronto here, for example, we've seen a number of deals that I've been able to make with the city as it relates to finalizing a deal on subways and making sure that that was signed. We've got a deal soon to announce on a Toronto Builds, and I won't go into the details of it, but
share. We'd love to hear
it. To come, I got to stand at the podium with Olivia, but there's been a lot of work to land deals with municipalities and get more things built more quickly. But again, just in the interest of honesty, I mean, these things are going to take time to get built. You don't build homes in 1, 2, 3 months. One area that I have been able to, I think, move the needle on in a more significant way is around addressing homelessness. People should know, since the pandemic, we have increased Reaching Homeless, our national homelessness strategy. We've increased funding by almost 400%. We maintain that funding. We deliver $4 billion through the Rapid Housing Initiative to get homes built to transitional housing shelters and supportive housing. I have been able to, in my role, make sure that as dollars were going to lapse at the end of this fiscal, repurpose them specifically to address homelessness. And there are communities that weren't going to receive federal funds, that were really struggling with challenges in their communities, encampments in their communities, and I have been able to get dollars into those communities that wouldn't otherwise have gotten them.
How does that work? Because, I suspect we'd agree on this. I cannot remember a time, and I'm a little older than you, where we have seen homeless encampments in every major city and town in this province, and it's shocking.
Yeah.
So how does what you are trying to do actually reflect itself in reality?
A few different ways. So, and like you, I've seen it not only here in Toronto, I mean, crisscrossing the province for the Ontario Liberal leadership in 2023, it came up everywhere, right? And it came up from a number of different ways. People would say, from a very compassionate perspective, they would say, these are neighbors and they need our help, and there are too many people in need of help, we need to do more. And there were others that were saying, our main streets and our parks, and these are public spaces, and they need to be welcoming to everyone. And I think part of it is the clarity of what the goal is, and the goal is to make sure we do have welcoming public spaces that are welcoming to everyone, at the same time as we ensure we treat everyone with dignity. And to do that, we need to make sure that we are building more homes that are accessible and available. And
who's the we there?
All partners. So the federal government has a role to play on the spending power, and we're seeing, I mentioned $4 billion that's already been delivered. There's another $1 billion at CMHC that is being allocated for transitional housing, emergency shelters, and supportive housing. You also need, the continuum of housing. So when I was on PEI, the Boys and Girls Club had an emergency shelter that they support, and then there's transitional housing that they've built. And what comes next is affordable housing that is not up to market, but it's also not a shelter, and it's also not transitional housing. So we do need to lean into, and this is the community housing, non-market housing conversation, we do really need to lean into that, because if you want to make sure there's that continuum, if you want to make sure there's affordability across the spectrum there is a much more forceful role for the government to play, all governments, the provincial government too. Ontario used to have, in the 60s, an Ontario Housing Authority under a provincial a progressive conservative government here that got social housing built. We have a huge social housing stock. I just met the housing minister in New Brunswick, but it's dated. We haven't built a ton of it in recent years. And so we got to do more of that. We got to update the existing stock we've got and retrofit it, but we've got to build more, because otherwise you're going to see it on our streets, you're going to see it in our parks, and that's not acceptable for all sorts of reasons.
I know this is tough, but I also know that it shouldn't be as intractable a problem as it has appeared to be over the last decade or so. And to that end, I mean, I saw an example in Hamilton the other day where they are building these they're homes, but they look actually like very tiny shelters.
Tiny homes, yeah.
Yeah, tiny homes. And they get people out of the cold and they give them a place to sleep and to be. They give them a place to be. Why, why can't that happen nationally quickly? What's preventing it from happening?
It is, but again, it's not a question of direction, it's one of scale. So this is the Rapid Housing Initiative that I was speaking to. So, and I'll use an example in my own backyard in East York. The city put up a parking lot. We put in capital dollars through the Affordable Housing Innovation Fund, which was a precursor to the Rapid Housing Initiative. And 60 modular housing units were built in under 2 years. And there are 60 people who have exited the shelter system and now are living in bachelor units. And there is support there from the social service agencies. But here's the challenge. When I speak to the progressive conservative housing minister on PEI, he talks about wraparound supports and the provincial role there, and it's healthcare, and that's their role. We can bring in capital dollars to build. Municipalities, provinces, feds, we can all put up public land, and then provinces have to step up with wraparound supports. Not every province is at the table in the same way on wraparound supports, and they need to be.
Is Ontario?
No, and here's my challenge to Ontario. Ontario has increased homelessness housing spending, but they've not increased housing spending overall. And so we've seen social housing spending decline significantly. And as we have increased our social housing spending, as we've gotten back in the game federally since 2017 and 2018, as our dollars have gone up, the provincial dollars on social housing have gone down.
So it's a wash.
That's right, and it's unacceptable. And so, I'm glad to see Premier Ford step up and really give President Trump a good go, and that's what he's got to do right now. But, when all's said and done on healthcare, on housing, there's a lot more he and his team have got to do.
Can we solve this problem? I know we're not going to solve this problem in 3 months.
But we can lay track to do it.
Well,
for sure,
that's what I'm wondering. Like, how much of a dent can you actually make in this problem for the amount of time, for the period of time in which you're going to have this job?
Yeah, so one, it's been getting dollars out the door. Two, it's been how do we make the most of those dollars? So I'll use the Housing Infrastructure Fund as an example. We have a $6 billion fund for, across the country for all provinces on housing enabling infrastructure. And I mentioned meeting the Quebec builders. They said in Quebec alone the gap is $45 billion, and here we got a $6 billion fund. Now, again, CIB, the infrastructure bank, has a role to play in this too on the financing side and just changing how we do business. But when we want to drive down development charges, Ontario and BC are the worst actors on this in driving down the cost of home building. So I'm trying to make the most of this housing infrastructure fund, and I'm trying to do deals with municipalities directly where I'm saying, give it your best shot. We want to help you with housing enabling infrastructure, but I also want you to take action on DCs, development charges. So I'm starting to have conversations with municipalities that are saying, can you defer the collection until occupancy and waive interest? Can you waive development charges entirely on the first 4 units of a multi-unit residential build? And we're starting to establish best practices with municipal actors to drive down the cost of home building. So, that's on my watch just in the last few weeks. The last piece, and this is the what comes next. Because, Carney has rightly said it's time to build. It is time to build, especially when it comes to housing. And there are additional steps municipalities and provinces have to take to get out of the way of home building. And on the tax side, on the regulation side, and the red tape side. I think we can play a more forceful role on innovation, on the prefab offsite construction side, drive economies of scale. There's a role to play for the feds on the spending power. The other place and I've said it already, but, of the entire housing stock, do you know how much is social community housing?
Nope.
Under 4%. It's less than half the OECD average. In the UK, it's 16%. Okay? So my goal, however long I occupy this role, I'm just going to keep repeating until we get to this place. I want to see us double in the next 7 to 10 years, double non-market community housing. That will be an important contribution if we can make it.
Got a couple of minutes left here, so let's talk a little politics. I know that at some point, I presume, either Mark Carney or his team are going to come to you and they're going to say, Minister, when do you think we should call the election? What are you going to tell them?
I think that we've got to get as much done as we possibly can in a short runway, and there are a few things that I'm trying to tie up over the next couple of weeks. I do think when you look at my conversations with Canadians, when I see questions asked that pollsters are asking, an overwhelming majority of Canadians are saying need a mandate. All opposition parties have said they're going to bring us down. Jagmeet Singh is on and off again on that. I'm not really sure, but overwhelmingly the opposition parties are saying they're going to bring us down when we go back to Parliament. So my advice would be, you don't have a seat in the House. we're going to have an election this year one way or another. You need a mandate to defend our national interests vis-a-vis Trump. So let's go to an election in the next 2 weeks.
Should he call it this week or next week?
I would say, around March 20th, March 22nd, whatever it is, before we go back to Parliament. I mean, he doesn't have if he had a seat in Parliament, I might feel differently about it. If we weren't facing a threat of tariffs, I might feel differently about it. If we had a partner in Parliament, I might feel differently about it. But none of that is true. So let's go seek a mandate. Let's have Canadians, Canadians have to make a call, and let's get back to work.
Is it a problem to have a national election in the middle of this tariff war with the United States?
No, and I'll say it for a couple of reasons. One is I think in Prime Minister Trudeau, he has really met the moment, and we have established an incredibly strong response. Provinces have been part of that, and what needs to be in place is in place. And the second thing to say is when it comes to the damage to our economy, this isn't like the pandemic where everything shuts down, right? This is going to hurt us, but it's going to hurt us over a longer period of time. And there's an opportunity, especially when it comes to stimulus, when we think about it being time to build, what are we going to build, how are we going to build in the short term, but it's going to benefit us in the long term. Those are decisions that don't have to be made overnight in a rush. They should be made thoughtfully in partnership with industry and non-market actors.
In our last 20 seconds here, once upon a time you said you weren't going to run again. Now you are running again.
Yeah.
What's changed? I
mean, I said this when I was sworn in as the minister, but I signed up to this job to make the biggest difference that I could. And when I talked to my wife about it in December, she said it's terrible and you should do it. You make a big difference. And when I asked my 8-year-old, he said no. And I said, well, why not? He goes, well, I want you to coach my baseball. And so my commitment is I'll be housing minister and also an East York baseball coach.
You're going to do both?
I'll do both, yeah.
Okay, that I got to see. Because you're going to be
doable.
I wonder. You're going to be working 80-hour weeks. I don't know how much time you're going to have to coach baseball.
The thing is, you got to carve out space for what's most important. And what's more important than my 8-year-old playing baseball?
Nothing.
Yeah.
That's the answer. That's Nate Erskine-Smith. He's the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities and the Liberal MP for a little while longer anyway in Beaches, East York, seeking re-election there. Thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks, Stephen.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, March 11th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, can municipalities operate on buying Canadian goods alone? We'll explore that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.